thought I was supposed to do that. Hey everyone, I'm Zeke O'Callahan, and I share a birthday with a very famous and very large theropod dinosaur, Dynamosaurus imperiosus, named in 1905 by Henry Fairfield Osborn, the same guy who actually named Tyrannosaurus rex. And in some ways, Dynamosaurus was pretty similar, such as the jaw, which is really built in a very similar way. However, it was also found with a bunch of osteoderms nearby. Osteoderms mean bone and skin, so it's a bone growing inside of the skin. And so when you think about the osteoderms, you really want to think about things like the kind of scutes that are found in Ankylosaurus. This is a bone growing inside the skin, and it's really weird to find these in a theropod dinosaur like Dynamosaurus. And the thing is, Dynamosaurus was found in some of the same rocks that Tyrannosaurus and Ankylosaurus had been found in, both coming from the latest part of the Cretaceous in North America. And that's actually really odd, because it seems pretty obvious that people would have known about Dynamosaurus. It would have been more common in most media, especially as a very strange and similarly sized rival to Tyrannosaurus rex. But that's the thing, Dynamosaurus imperiosus doesn't exist anymore, and that's really coming down to taxonomy. Now, it was named on October 5th, 1905. That still is very much a fact. But the thing is, when we're thinking about taxonomy, whatever name an animal was given first is the one that sticks with it. And sometimes the fossils aren't good enough to actually say that it belongs to that group, or we find out it was a different animal all along. So for example, Troodon's just a tooth. We don't use the name Troodon anymore. And Dynamosaurus is another example of this, where we actually found out it was just two different animals that kind of got jumbled together. And that makes sense when you're thinking about how fossilization actually happens. You need to bury the animal in a lot of mud or sand. And so if there's moving water, different animals are going to get pushed all to the same location. And that's what it seems like happened with Dynamosaurus. First, the osteoderms. They actually seem to come from a nodosaur, so something related to the ankylosaurs. One of the nodosaurs that would have been around during this time period would have been Denversaurus from, believe it or not, Denver, but at least lets us know the nodosaurs ranged from parts of Wyoming into parts of Colorado. So they at least had a decent range during the latest part of the Cretaceous. But the other animal that got washed in was the Tyrannosaurus rex. So Dynamosaurus is actually just Tyrannosaurus. And before you click off and go, oh, he doesn't actually share a birthday with it, I still do. Because in the paper that was published on October 5th, 1905 that described Dynamosaurus, exactly one page earlier is the name Tyrannosaurus rex, used for the first time in history. And when I do say first, there are some fossils that are probably Tyrannosaurus rex, like those of Manispondylus gigas. The thing is, Manispondylus gigas is literally just a vertebra, so it's not really diagnostic in a way that can tell us for sure what an animal is. Think back to when I mentioned Troodon earlier, where it's just a tooth. That doesn't really help us to better understand what exactly Troodon was doing in its environment, and it's not really diagnostic to say, yeah, it's absolutely this animal. Animals can have similar teeth, animals can have similar vertebra. This means that the specimens that Henry Fairfield Osborn found are much better for the holotype of a species. And a holotype is just essentially the key. It's what every other organism is compared to. And there's holotypes for anything. If you think of even very common animals, like house sparrows or brown rats, there's a specimen that is designated as a holotype that all of the other ones are compared to in a museum collection somewhere. But what do we actually know about Tyrannosaurus rex? Well, the thing is, it's the most famous dinosaur in the world, and while it's great for me to share a birthday with it, that also means a lot of people want to study it. So probably more than any other fossil animal, Tyrannosaurus rex has been very well studied. And that's really great, because that means we can tell a lot about how it might have lived. First, we're going to look at Nanotyrannus, which was a small tyrannosaur found from the same rocks as Tyrannosaurus rex and described in 1988. And a lot of people for a long time thought it was a totally different genus and species than Tyrannosaurus rex. However, as we continue to find more and more juvenile and teenage Tyrannosaurus rex, we actually more or less came to the conclusion that no, Nanotyrannus really is just a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. And some of the studies that looked at Nanotyrannus were very extensive. And when I say extensive, I mean, for example, one by Thomas Carr that looked at over 44 different specimens believed to have been from Tyrannosaurus rex, and looking at over 1,800 different features in those fossils, and found that no, there's not really a separate group that turns into Nanotyrannus. Instead, it's really just a growth series. And the thing with growth is it's actually really easy to tell in some Tyrannosaurus rex fossils what the growth series might have been like. The growth pattern of Tyrannosaurus rex was incredibly rapid. And by that I mean they would grow really quickly. For example, you can look at some other tyrannosaurs, such as Daspletosaurus, Albertosaurus, and Gorgosaurus. And then there's the line for Tyrannosaurus rex, and you can see it's a much steeper line that reaches a much larger weight because Tyrannosaurus was just that massive. This brings up questions about the absolute growth rate of Tyrannosaurus rex. And honestly, it's kind of similar to a human's. They would have stayed relatively small up until about their early teenage years. And relatively small for a Tyrannosaurus rex is only 2 tons. And from then on, they'd be gaining about 11 kilograms or about 25 pounds each week, for a total of just over half a ton each year. And this would continue for a few years, up until about the time that they were 20. So it really is a lot like human growth rates. They started slow, had a massive growth spurt during their teenage years, and then would continue to live on for a while. The way we can tell this is through histology. Histology is the study of tissues, which can include things like muscles, but also includes bones. And by using certain bones, such as the femur in Tyrannosaurus rex fossils, we can actually take very thin slices, grind them down to less than a millimeter thick, shine a light through them, and see little lines in the fossil. These are called lines of arrested growth. And this just means that the growth rate slowed down, so the bone that was deposited was denser. And this would happen generally yearly because there's going to be a wet and a dry period, or a winter and a summer, where productivity is going to change and is going to affect the amount of food an organism is going to be able to get. In fact, there's one animal you can actually pretty much just see these in, and that's bighorn sheep, where you can actually see the lines that go all the way through the horns are where those lines of arrested growth actually happened during the winters for those animals. So we're applying that same concept to the fossil record with Tyrannosaurus rex. This means we've been able to tell they had a growth pattern very similar to a human's, except for later in life. And that's because Tyrannosaurus rex was very much a case of live fast and die young. And so we can really tell what the ages of different Tyrannosaurus rex specimens were. And with the most famous being Sue and my birthday being today, guess who has 2 thumbs and outlived Sue the T-Rex? This guy! And by looking at this 3D print of that skull, you can really see how Tyrannosaurus rex's skull doesn't always come out looking as nice as you might think. Even in Tyrannosaurus rex, the largest carnivore to have ever lived, the weight of tons of rock on top of it still deforms the skull. And that means we need to essentially undo that deformation. And that gets us our modern day reconstruction of a Tyrannosaurus rex skull. When we're actually studying these skulls though, we can do some different kinds of math to try and estimate what its bite force would have been. And this isn't just from the skull. Instead, we can also use some fossils that have been bitten by Tyrannosaurus rex to try and understand how powerfully it could have bite. And most of these estimates end up somewhere between 30 and 60,000 pounds of force, which is a pretty broad range, but would put it as the most powerful bite of any animal to have lived on land. In fact, some of these fossils that have been bitten into are things like a pelvis from Triceratops, and it's actually the underside of the pelvis, meaning that Tyrannosaurus rex was reaching way into the carcass to try and access this, rather than eating some of the meats that were further out on the body. It also means that the body was probably pretty well decayed, and this doesn't mean, like some researchers have suggested, that maybe Tyrannosaurus rex was a scavenger. The idea that Tyrannosaurus rex only scavenged is mostly based on scans of the brain case. Reptiles, like some other animals, have a very tight brain case that matches the shape of the brain inside of the skull. This means when you're scanning it, you can actually tell which parts of the brain are larger than others. And that includes things like the olfactory bulb, which processes the smells that it would have been in its environment. And Tyrannosaurus rex did have a very large one of these. But at the same time, so do wolves. But wolves also go around and hunt things, so having a great sense of smell doesn't mean you necessarily needed to be just a scavenger the way a turkey vulture is. But of course, there's other evidence for hunting as well. And one of the main pieces of this comes from an Edmontosaurus, a hadrosaur that would have lived in the same environment. And it's actually a really interesting fossil because it has a damaged tail vertebra. And this might seem a little bit unimportant, except for the fact that this damaged tail vertebra healed. And so whatever damaged its tail, it got away from or otherwise recovered from. And inside of that damaged part of the bone, where the bone grew around where the injury was, there's a Tyrannosaurus rex tooth inside of the bone, meaning that this hadrosaur, probably while it was young, was bitten by a Tyrannosaurus rex, escaped and was able to live long enough for some of that bone to actually heal back around a tooth that got stuck in the wound. But that doesn't mean it only scavenged. Alongside that pelvis of Triceratops, there's also some animals that were fed on by other tyrannosaurs coming from Asia, and specifically another type of hadrosaur. And what we're looking at is one of the bones on this hadrosaur that had a lot of the meat and flesh on the bone scraped off. What it seems like happened with this hadrosaur is it died and was transported some distance by water, and only part of it was poking above the sand that had partially buried it. And at that point, a tyrannosaur came along and actually fed on parts of this carcass. And we can tell that because there's very even scrape marks along parts of the bones. And this might seem unimportant, but Tyrannosaurus rex and its relatives had very interesting front teeth, especially on the upper jaw, where they were generally shorter and had a D shape. And what I mean by a D shape is if you cut the tooth in half, it would have the cross section of a D shape. And that means that flat part could be used to scrape meat off of bones. And it actually seemingly did this pretty well. It seems like it actually got to both sides of the bone in question and was able to scrape most of the meat off of it. And then the fossil got buried even more, and we ended up getting it in the fossil record. But that also means that animal had already died, and a Tyrannosaur came up and scavenged on it, much like what probably happened with that Triceratops pelvis. So Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't only a hunter or wasn't only a scavenger. Instead, it kind of did a bit of both. Moving beyond the head though, Tyrannosaurus rex did also have famously short arms, and some people think it may have had a third finger still. Sometimes it still has this part of the third finger as opposed to the actual finger part of it preserved, meaning potentially there was some sort of cartilage there or some sort of feature that suggests maybe it did kind of have one. But for all practical purposes, it probably didn't. Instead, it just had two very well-muscled fingers. And I say that because, well, sure, its arm was probably about the length of mine. It could also curl 500 pounds, and I am not a strong man by any suit, but the idea of just being able to curl 500 pounds seems unlikely for 99% of people, if not all of them. The fact that they're so well muscled does suggest they served some sort of a purpose. And there's actually a talk coming up at the Geological Society of America meeting later this week that's talking about whether or not Tyrannosaurus rex may have had handedness, that is, being right or left-handed. This also suggests that Tyrannosaurus rex had a specific use for its arms, because otherwise they'd both kind of atrophy and there wouldn't be a preference for one side or the other. And so what this means is hopefully we're going to get some more research that is going to help explain what exactly Tyrannosaurus rex's arms are for, because there's been a lot of ideas, but none of them are really sticking that well just yet. And now we're going to go to the feet, which are actually pretty interesting. I know it doesn't seem like they should be, it's just feet, but they actually have a very specific adaptation that other large theropods didn't have, and that's called an arctometatarsus. The metatarsals are some of the foot bones, and the arcto prefix just means that the middle toe bone gets really narrow and pinched between the other two. And this seems really minor, but you compare things like a Tyrannosaurus rex foot and something like an Allosaurus foot, and you can see the stark difference. And what this means is that Tyrannosaurus rex would have been really efficient at running. Well, not running, at least by some definitions, because when most people consider running, they suggest that what you actually need is both feet to be off the ground at the same time. And Tyrannosaurus rex was so heavy it probably couldn't do that, but it probably could have walked over long distances very efficiently. And there's a couple of other features in the legs that actually may have helped it do this even more so. In general, we find that Tyrannosaurus rex probably moved at similar speeds to the other large theropod dinosaurs, so probably somewhere around 8 to 12 kilometers per hour, although some researchers have suggested speeds as high as 30 kilometers per hour, and there's a lot of variation in it. However, one of the key things that may have given Tyrannosaurs and Tyrannosaurus rex a leg up on their competition is the fact that they were probably more agile. This was found by using a measure of how quickly the leg could rotate. And essentially what you're trying to do is maximize that rotation speed so that you can pivot and rotate your legs faster. And it seems like Tyrannosaurus rex probably could have done that a little bit more, meaning it would have been more agile during a hunt. And a lot of this helps to suggest some of the other things and trends that we find in the fossil record during the last half of the Cretaceous, especially in North America. 80 million years before Tyrannosaurus rex, we were in the late Jurassic. And in North America, this was during the deposition of the Morrison Formation, which famously holds a lot of different dinosaurs, including many sauropods, but also quite a few large theropods. including things like Saurophaganax, Allosaurus, and Torvosaurus, just to name a few. And this is really interesting when you consider the large theropods in Tyrannosaurus rex's environment, which are Tyrannosaurus rex. That's really it. In fact, if you actually compare the ecosystem of things like the Hell Creek Formation, where Tyrannosaurus rex is from, and compare it to modern day ecosystems such as the Serengeti, it would be equivalent of having something like a bat-eared fox as one of the largest predators, and then a lion as the other largest predator. It's really interesting that Tyrannosaurs and Tyrannosaurus rex seem to have lived in environments that mostly didn't have other, even relatively large carnivores. And we really don't see that pattern until they start gaining a lot of success in the last half of the Cretaceous. So it seems like, potentially because of their very accelerated growth rate, that Tyrannosaurs may have been able to outcompete some of the young of other large theropods, and then essentially became the only large theropods in most parts of most environments in the northern hemisphere. This also means that Tyrannosaurus rex could grow to massive sizes because there wasn't the same amount of competition. And when I say massive sizes, we can consider animals like Giganotosaurus and Spinosaurus. And Tyrannosaurus rex may have been actually shorter than both, but it made up for it in girth. Tyrannosaurus rex was chunky. Think Moto Moto from Madagascar 2. This girth made Tyrannosaurus heavier than both Giganotosaurus and Spinosaurus, both of which were built in very narrow body plans. This also means that Tyrannosaurus rex probably was around 7 or so tons, and while there's still debate about that, Tyrannosaurus rex is thought to have generally been heavier than either. And so we've already talked about two similarities that Tyrannosaurus rex already has had with people. The first is that very accelerated growth rate, and the other is long distance running. It seems like some of the first humans to evolve in parts of Africa actually evolved some abilities to do long distance running so that they could better hunt different types of prey. Because even the fastest prey like impala, eventually they slow down and tire out. Meanwhile, humans are better built for long distance running and could then catch up with the prey. So actually, Tyrannosaurus rex may have had a lot in common with us, but there still may be one more thing that it's actually pretty similar to us in, and that's it may have lived in groups. And I say may because there's no smoking gun evidence that really defines like, yeah, no, it absolutely lived in groups. And there's a lot of variation in groups. For example, you have some animals like cheetahs where sometimes a mother and her cubs will hang out for a long time, and then the cubs, if they're male, will hang out for a long time. But other times they'll be solitary. Or for example, wildebeest, where generally they're in pretty small groups, but for massive migrations, they all come together. So there's a lot of different reasons animals may have been in groups. The main evidence for this in Tyrannosaurus rex, though, comes from 3 different pieces of evidence. And the first of these are actually 2 that are pretty similar. One is in Albertosaurus, and one is in Tetraphonius, both earlier tyrannosaurs that lived in North America. And there's 2 sites where, in one case, Albertosaurus was found in a group, and in the other where Terattophonius was found in a group. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times flowing water can jumble things together, but it's still a bit strange to have this high density of just one type of animal without other things mixed in. The other is a trackway from a time period where the only really large carnivores in North America seem to have been tyrannosaurs, and it shows a number of animals heading in mostly the same direction, and that's not exactly hard evidence. One of them could have walked over the area before another, so it may not be directly group living, but at least there's some evidence that they were actually coming into contact with one another. And actually there is one more piece of evidence, and that actually comes from Tyrannosaurus rex itself. Specifically, one of the young specimens of Tyrannosaurus rex, which actually had some bite marks on its face. And these aren't really hard bite marks. Instead, it may have been something to do with social signaling. And actually some crocodilians do this today, and crocodilians, other than the birds, are the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs. So potentially there's some common ancestry in that trait of face biting. But we also need to consider the environment that made Tyrannosaurus rex what it was. And when we think about Tyrannosaurus rex fossils, most of the time they're coming from places like South Dakota or Wyoming, which are famously not very warm. Meanwhile, the kind of environment that Tyrannosaurus rex was found in was exceedingly warm. In fact, it actually seems like Tyrannosaurus rex would have lived in not just a heavily forested environment, but potentially at times an even swampy-like environment, which isn't something we normally think of with long-distance running, but it seems to have worked for Tyrannosaurus rex. It seems like for the last 2 million years of the Cretaceous, it was doing pretty well. And then big rock from space came and killed off the non-avian dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus rex. But the thing is, Tyrannosaurus rex, despite all of these very cool adaptations, still died out because a giant rock from space hit the planet. But there were some things that did survive, and those were some of the animals in the trees above its head, because around this time period, Purgatorius first started to evolve. And Purgatorius is known mostly from just a few jaw fossils, but is potentially the first ever primate. This means that no matter how dominant you might be, like Tyrannosaurus rex, sometimes it's the smallest things in your environment that will become the most dominant in the future, especially if there's a giant rock from space hurtling towards the planet.